it's going to lose not only a lot of experience and expertise in the personnel that have been jettisoned for very ideological reasons, small government, etc., but it's also going to lose a lot of its coverage in terms of what it can defend against.
With me is the cybersecurity specialist, Dr. Tim Stevens from King's College London. Tim, welcome. We've seen this one Republican congressman saying Russia and China are laughing at America after Donald Trump fired that head of US Cyber Command. He was also head of the National Security Agency. Do you think they're really laughing?
Not sure they'll be laughing as a result of this precise incident, in which General Tim Hoch was fired as head of, as you say, NSA and US Cyber Command. I think what they may be looking at is a slight disarray in the US cybersecurity posture, both in the defensive side. We've seen a lot of toing and froing from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, but also on the more offensive side, which is where the US Cyber Command bit comes in. And as is always the way with military commands like US Cybercom, you want continuity of expertise, of leadership, and you also want consistent policy. And at the moment, it's unsure whether any of those applies to the US situation. So, in that respect, some of the US's strategic adversaries may be gaining some succor from that relative state of disarray.
The new acting head, William Hartman, has a background in offensive cyber operations. Is that the right sort of credentials you would need to lead US Cybercom?
Tim Hoch's replacement, Hartman, does have the requisite expertise and experience to lead a national force like US Cyber Command and indeed the National Security Agency. So, in that respect, I don't think there's a lack of continuity in terms of what the US and the US citizens can expect from his temporary replacement. We've yet to see, of course, whether he'll be confirmed in post. He has to go through congressional hearings like all senior military positions. So, yes, he does have the experience.
We've seen Donald Trump place into government some people who haven't been career specialists in the areas they're now in charge of. If that was to happen here, if Hartman didn't become the full-time head, what would that mean for cybersecurity?
That would be a far greater discontinuity and issue of concern. And we have, as you say, we've seen that elsewhere in US federal government where people have been put in positions where they are basically put there because they're loyalists, not because they have any particular expertise in that field. If that were to happen, I think not only elements of federal government and the military and intelligence communities, but also their allies would be somewhat concerned that you're giving what is an enormously important brief for the US government, but also for its security and intelligence partners, of which the UK is very clearly one. You have to have someone in those very, very senior. There's a four-star general role, US Cybercom and NSA. You have to have someone who understands the field and is making decisions based not just in operations, but of strategic decisions that affect US and allied national security. So having someone in that position who's not qualified is obviously going to be of concern to the US and its allies.
When General Hoare, the head of US Cyber Command, was appointed, he was seen as uncontroversial. He was unanimously approved by the Senate just 2 years ago. Will those partners, those allies of the United States, will they be worried about the nature of his firing, as well as the loss of his expertise?
Yes, I think they will be, because I think it's what's happening is the replacement potentially of senior officials like this, not because of their faith in the Constitution, but because of their perceived loyalty to the commander in chief. And those are two very, very different things. And when you're thinking about the types of alliances and partnerships that someone like the NSA or US Cyber Command needs in places like the UK, from GCHQ and Ministry of Defence and so on, you want someone who understands the culture of those organisations and is making decisions based on the right reasons, whether they're operational or strategic, not because of their political loyalties to the US president.
To step back very slightly, could you talk us through what exactly Cybercom does? It's a an element of the US military that some people aren't quite so familiar with.
Yeah, US Cyber Command was set up in 2010 to specifically dedicate its efforts and its expertise to defending US military information networks, but also to conducting operations in other people's networks. So there's a split there, if you like, between the defensive piece and the offensive piece. But it is a military organisation. It has a remit to defend military networks, as I said, but also to conduct, cyber operations, whether they're intelligence driven or whether they're more military in other parts of the world, in adversaries' networks. But the job is also to support allies. And they've been doing this very, very effectively over the past decade and a half. It's one of those parts of the US government that has a slightly odd name to some ears. But most of what they do is quite banal and benign. They protect networks as you'd expect anyone to protect their networks if they run a business or a other sort of government agency. But at times it conducts operations out of area. It conducts them either in support of military operations, as it's done in the Middle East repeatedly. It also supports its own military operating in other parts of the world. And it also conducts types of operations that we might consider cyber warfare, if you want to stretch the term warfare a little further. Also conducts forms of espionage and intelligence.
When we think about the defensive part of that job, we think about ransom attacks like the ones that sometimes hit British hospitals or the British Library. Is that the big risk here?
There is a risk in the way that US cybersecurity is being retooled and reorganized, in the sense that it's going to lose not only a lot of experience and expertise in the personnel that have been jettisoned for very ideological reasons, small government, etc., etc., but it's also going to lose a lot of its coverage in terms of what it can defend against. Now, US Cyber Command, its principal job is not necessarily defending municipalities and so on from ransomware attacks. That's not its job, but it's about having an integrated, coherent national capability that is protecting the United States. And we've seen people being lost from the civilian side and now from the military side. Whether that portends a greater fragmentation of US federal national cybersecurity or not, I don't know. But I think it is deeply concerning, because when you stop defending across the piece, there are always seams and veins in your defensive posture that can be exploited by adversaries. And unquestionably, if you reduce your defensive capacity, you increase your vulnerability.
Is that vulnerability the sort of hybrid warfare we talk about, deniable attacks that we fear that may come before more conventional attacks?
Yes, that's part of it. There's a two main adversaries, if you like, in this environment. One is criminal, and most of the ransomware attacks, for example, that we've seen have been criminal in nature, not all by any stretch. But there's the other side when we're talking about operations conducted by adversaries, and conventionally, it's Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, and they're very keen to exploit critical infrastructures and so on. Those sometimes it's difficult to tell whether they're intelligence gathering or whether they're beachheads for something more sinister in the future. But unquestionably, those are the types of things that the US will continue to be concerned about, and its allies. And reducing your defensive capacity, or even your capacity to respond, is never necessarily a net positive for national security.
Do we know what form the offensive operations you touched on being carried out by the US and its allies, do we know what form those take?
We know very, very little. This is a highly classified space. There's a very deep protection of what we call sources and methods around what type of operations have been undertaken. What little we do know is, for example, against ISIS, Daesh in the Middle East, where some cyber command capabilities were used to degrade the communications infrastructure of insurgents operating in Iraq and Syria. It was used, in a sense, also to sow distrust in those networks, so that they couldn't trust the communications and financial systems that they had. But there's not an awful lot known about it. But this is an organization of many, many thousands of people who are working every single day to protect military networks, the rather unglamorous side of it. But we know very, very little about the offensive side. But, where special forces are operating or where troops are deployed in forward positions, Cyber Command will have a role in supporting them, sometimes in very mundane ways, but also in support, actual operational support, and sometimes for the use of their capabilities for generating effects in those battle spaces in which troops are deployed.
We've talked a little about how allies might be worried and the dangers of this loss of expertise. Do you think the public is worried enough about the threats in this area?
Probably not. But then again, I wouldn't. It's not a counsel of despair here. But I think clearly one of the main communicative obstacles in this space is actually explaining to people why cybersecurity is important at all. Um, in academic literature, we talk about infrastructures as being invisible until they fail. And I think that's something that really applies in this space is that we use our devices on these networks and systems every single day to conduct business, leisure, and entertainment, and all the rest of it. But if the Wi-Fi goes down, then your kids are screaming. But if you're running a business and your internet goes down because there's been a breach of your networks or that your internet service provider has gone down, we've all experienced this. Then you begin to get a hint of what happens, for example, if there was a much larger scale deliberate attack on information networks and systems. And the job of, you know, our own sovereign capabilities in the UK, like GCHQ and the National Cybersecurity Centre, is to try and raise the level of security, of cybersecurity. In the US, you have CISA as the civilian agency that's tasked with doing something very, very similar. And if you reduce their capacity to advise and guide and support and react and respond to incidents and so on, you're getting into a space where we're almost deliberately laying ourselves open to the types of operations that adversaries may wish to conduct.
Dr. Tim Stevens at King's College London, thank you so much for your time today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.